Well, I promised to talk about it yesterday, and today I have the bad news. The CPI headline rate that the White House decided to front-run yesterday, and was saying, now this is going to be bad, but it's all Putin's fault. Remember, it's the Putin price hike. CPI, 8.54%, the highest official CPI since December 1981. Okay, so see, things are so bad, we're almost back into the 70s. And this is in the official terms. This is official inflation. Now, if you look at shadow stats, which tries to recalculate inflation based off of the old metrics, because you see what they do throughout the years. The federal government, I'm sure many of you have heard this before, has changed the way they calculate inflation to make it seem lower. And so you can't compare apples to apples inflation data from 1981 to inflation data from 2022. They're different. They were calculated differently. And so if you try and calculate inflation in the same way as it was, before, I believe in the 80s and then in the early 90s was the two times in which they revised how they calculate inflation, and they added in stupid things like hedonic adjustments and substitution and things like that. Essentially saying, hey, well, sure, the price of steak, doubled, but you can just eat a pork chop, and so we're going to say that there was no inflation because the price of a pork chop is now equal, to what filet mignon was last year. And, sure, the price of an iPhone is now like $1,200 or something, but, we really think that the iPhone is 3 times better than it was a couple years ago, and so in fact the price of smartphones has gone down, and so we're going to count that as deflation. When you do away with all that crap and all of the fake accounting that is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics or by the Fed, whoever it is that comes up with CPI, I guess it's Bureau of Labor Statistics, then you end up with a whopping 17% rate of inflation. That is, according to shadow stats, the highest, in constant terms when you look at inflation calculated the same way, going back as far as we have data. You calculate it the same way. That's the highest rate of inflation since June of 1947. It's the highest since post-war inflation. Okay, so this is really bad. This is catastrophic. And I believe the 10-year yield is still sitting somewhere around 2.5%. We're still under 3%. I mean, we're truly living in clown markets. Negative interest rates, or interest rates that are negative, what would that be, like 13%? Negative 14%? Oh, and guess what? It's only up like 1% from last month. Whether you're looking at the headline CPI number or if you're looking at shadow stats number, it's still, inflation's only 1% higher year over year than it was last month, before Putin started his war. So the Putin price hike doesn't seem to have had that big of an effect compared to, when you consider how high inflation already was before the Putin price hike. And so it really is pathetic to see that, that propaganda game, even though, they're going to do it. But I mean, come on, you really look at the number. Yeah, it's up a lot, and it's accelerating quick. But it's been accelerating since Joe Biden was elected. Now, I don't place all the blame for the inflation squarely on Joe Biden's shoulders. Certainly not. I blame the Fed primarily. And then secondarily, of course, you have the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Trump did his part to spend many, many trillions of dollars as well. But at the end of the day, the inflation did start to break out under Joe Biden, and his administration has done nothing to try and quell it. In fact, they've done the opposite. If you want inflation to go away, the Federal Reserve needs to raise interest rates. That's the first thing that has to happen. They need to raise them substantially. They need to kill the asset bubble. They need to kill stocks, bonds, and real estate. That's the number one thing you got to do. And then second, the federal government, which of course this will happen if you kill the bond market, but the federal government needs to stop spending. They just need to quit. Because you know how the federal government loves to talk about their blessed stimulus? You know what government stimulus is? That's inflation. It's a euphemism for inflation. It's the federal government creating inflation and then trying to masquerade, as creating economic growth. Because they pass their so-called stimulus bill and they say, look at all this money that we spent. It's not going to help the economy. It's, no, you're just spending money and bidding up the price of goods. So yeah, you could, create a lot of transactions that way. Those are transactions paid for by inflation because you're not stimulating economic growth. That's not sustainable when the government just goes out and spends money, because then as soon as that money is spent, well, then that's the end of the line. But what they are stimulating is inflation, because they're creating more money and introducing more money into the system without creating more goods. And at a time in which the administration is pursuing a policy of that appears to be a policy of autarky, they are closing us off rapidly from the rest of the world. They've closed us off from Russia. They are preparing to close us off from India. They are threatening China, that the U.S. markets will be closed to China soon. And thus, they will be depriving the American economy of extremely scarce resources. I hate to break it, to the Tesla bulls. You can say Tesla's the most American-made car all you want, but without China, you're not getting those batteries. A so-called green future, a green energy future, which, it's not even green, but I don't want to get into that tangent again. All these things that people associate with green energy, big batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, it's not just a green future, it's a Chinese future. You need China for that. We need China for most everything in American industry, even if you are, again, I took the example of Tesla because people say it's the most American-made car because, it's made here. Well, it still is not possible without Chinese resources. So even the most American-made car in America could not be made without the Chinese at this point. What we could make in this country? We could, again, if we wanted to, build 57 Chevys. Or something like that, something that is completely analog, that doesn't have computer chips in it, and that only needs iron ore and maybe copper to function. Really abundant resources, not extremely scarce rare earth minerals. The complexity of our economy is enabled by the relative abundance, and these are still extremely scarce, that's why I say relative abundance, of materials that are throughout almost all of human history have been, unobtainium. Because we have such a, expansive global economy and open sea lanes and all these things, global free trade, we're able to take resources that, might exist in abundance in only one little speck of the planet and distribute them to industry across the entire planet. Countries don't have to rely on resources that are abundant in their own country and therefore abundant in general across the planet. We don't have to rely on just iron ore and coal and oil at this very moment. It is possible for a brief period now in human history to produce things like electric cars that have never been viable. And the viability of such industries is limited by globalism. We need a globalized economy in order for these things to happen. And that's something that the U.S. administration simply doesn't know. They don't understand that they will be sending America back to the 1950s. Now, some of us, might like that. Personally, I much prefer a carburetor or a mechanical injection pump to these batteries that spontaneously combust, or to, electronic fuel injection controlled by some computer board made in Taiwan. But, what's the point in all this? I was talking about inflation. What does this have to do with inflation? Well, inflation, the way that the U.S. measures it, is they're just measuring increases in prices. Normally, most people, when they think of inflation, they're thinking just about increases in the money supply, which I think is the important academic way of looking at it. But when you're looking at so-called inflation data, you're seeing a mix of the results of monetary inflation, which is an inflation of the money supply, and just an inflation of prices for other reasons, because prices can rise either because of monetary inflation, the inflation of the money supply, or they can rise because of an increase in relative scarcity. When it is monetary inflation causing the prices to go up, that is, that's an increase in the demand side. But when you see prices rise because of the scarcity of resources, that is a supply side issue. It's you look at it, in a basic Econ 101 course, the supply and demand curves are moving in different directions, and so it's hard to isolate to what extent the increase in prices is a demand issue, i.e. monetary inflation, money printing, and to what extent it is a supply issue, i.e. de-globalization. Because it's clear at this point, we're embarking on that path. And so if I were in the Biden administration and I wanted inflation to go down, I'd be doing the opposite of what I'm doing now. I would stop all this government spending. I would stop the Fed from printing so much money. I would raise interest rates up to at least 10%. And I would reverse the deglobalization trend that the Biden administration has embarked on. It's funny, we were told that Trump was the isolationist and that Trump was going to, destroy global free trade, and we were all going to be poorer. And even I said that because based on Trump's rhetoric, that's what he was saying. I was saying, wow, this is pretty nuts. I mean, this is going to really impact your standard of living. And I didn't think that Trump's voters or the average American really understood that entirely. But now we have the Biden administration doing really everything that I feared Trump would do. The worst things I feared Trump would do. And they didn't even run on this. They ran on the opposite. When Biden got elected, I thought, well, gee, at least I don't have to worry about, supplies of goods being cut off from China because, Joe Biden is a Chinese puppet. That's what I thought. And you know what? In the long run, these terrible mistakes that are being made by these people, will benefit me because I do personally really hate all of the over technologification. I'm trying to invent a new term. I don't think that'll be the one I stick with. But the overcomplication of everything in our society, the insertion of computer chips into everything, chips which are not, I like analog, not digital. Analog is something that you can fix. It's something that you can perceive in the real world. Something digital, something goes wrong with it, you throw it out and you start with a new one. And that's okay in some aspects, like a personal computer or a cell phone. Those are much better off being digital. An analog personal computer, that's like an abacus. It's not very efficient. But when you compare like a digitally controlled car versus an analog car, the analog car is much more reliable and it's much easier to diagnose if something goes wrong, and you can keep it on the road, forever really if you maintain it. And even if, get to the point and you say, you know what, it's just not worth fixing this thing anymore, you can melt it down and build a new car. It's 100% recyclable because it's just made out of steel, which is iron ore. The same thing is true with a refrigerator. Have you ever seen a refrigerator that's like, 40 years old or 50 years old? If you keep one in your house and you've still had it this entire time and you never threw it out, it probably still works. Whereas the refrigerators and other appliances that they're putting out today, all are controlled by chips and things made in Taiwan, which can be, of course, turned offline, by a Chinese war in Taiwan. And, if anything ever goes wrong with them, pretty much you got to throw it out and buy a new one. I mean, heck, with cars, that's true with, like the AC now. If your AC stops working in your car, odds are the part isn't made anymore, and you just have to buy a new car. And so long term, I will, I'll give the point that what the Biden administration is doing, I think inadvertently, might be a good thing for American society. But in the short run, it's going to be extremely painful, and I think that it could bring down the current system. I mean, what we're witnessing here, I have to hand it, I guess, to Vladimir Putin, because we're told all this is Putin's fault. But Putin has, if you listen to the Biden administration, has single-handedly dismantled globalism. We are walking the path towards deglobalization. And the result of that will be, even leaving aside the Fed's printing. Even if the Fed had a neutral policy, which the Fed has never had a neutral policy, but they claim often that they do, but it's always been accommodative. But let's say that the Fed was able to hold the money supply constant and completely remove the monetary inflation factor and control that, so that all the changes in prices that we're seeing were purely determined, by the supply side in aggregate. Even in that case, the result of what is being done would mean that prices in the U.S. economy would necessarily skyrocket, because so many things that I look around and I see that we use in our everyday lives just simply wouldn't exist anymore. And so we'd have to come up with alternatives to producing those things, or we'd just have to go without them. Maybe instead of a Swiffer wet jet, with a battery-powered little spray nozzle and these fancy bottles of cleaning solution, that nicely, fit into the holder, and all these, these custom molded plastic parts that are assembled by people with tiny little hands using tiny little screwdrivers in China. Maybe we'd have to go back to using, a mop with just a bunch of, I don't know, what is it, polyester or whatever a mop head is traditionally made out of, with a wooden handle. Something simple that we can actually produce here in America, because, I guarantee you that Swiffer wet jet I'm looking at in my garage, it's not made here. And it's not the kind of thing that could, easily be, well, I guess it could easily be produced here, but there's lots of things that wouldn't. And a lot of things that would be too expensive to produce here. And so just look at what sorts of things are made in America currently. You can go out if you really want and buy a made in America screwdriver. But it's going to be expensive. And the reason why it's expensive is because labor costs and regulation costs are extremely high here in the United States. And so if they're going to manufacture anything here, it's going to be much more expensive than it is elsewhere. But if they can make something that is, to begin with, a cheap enough item to where the huge premium, whatever it is, 1,000% premium that you pay for something made in America is still affordable to you. Sure, you can go out and buy a screwdriver for $1 at Harbor Freight. But, maybe for $5 or $6, you can buy one that's made in America. Some people might be willing to pay that premium. The same thing is true when you look at something like the example I gave earlier of a fancy Swiffer wet jet mop versus just a standard wood handle mop. The Swiffer wet jet thing is affordable when made in China. You bring it over to make it here in America, the cost would skyrocket. And the same thing would be true for that wood handled mop. I bet that wood handled mop you could probably make, for $1.50 in China. But here in America, it might cost $10 to make. But it would be a lot cheaper than that Swiffer wet jet. In fact, it would probably be priced similarly to the made in China Swiffer wet jet. And so, in order to make things here in America, we're going to have resources are more scarce. Labor is going to be more scarce. We're going to have to economize by using less complex and less advanced consumer goods. That's what we will be consuming. That's a real-world example of how our wealth is going to decrease in the future, in the near future. I gave the example earlier of a made-in-America screwdriver. You can have a made-in-America screwdriver, sure. It's going to be really expensive compared to the made-in-China screwdriver, but, it's still feasible. You can buy it if you want. It's an expensive screwdriver, but compared to other items, it's not that expensive, But think of, for example, a made-in-America power drill. You see any of those? I know DeWalt says made in USA, but if you read the fine print, it says made in USA with global materials. And if you look up, videos of the DeWalt factory, it doesn't look like they're making power tools from scratch. If you catch what I mean. I think they might be pulling a fast one on you. And there's a reason for that. It's because making something as complex as a power tool, even though that's not, it's not complex compared to a lot of things. It's not a smartphone. It's not a personal computer. It's still much too expensive to make those things here. Look at you want something more realistic, look at the price of a Snap-on power tool. like a snap-on impact gun. They're like $1,000 for something that, made in China costs like $300. And so when you're talking about something that is already a big ticket item, even when it's made in China, and then you add that made in America premium onto it, it's absurd. Nobody's going to buy those things. Or the people who do are people who absolutely need them, and they will, maintain them and take very good care of them. And it's not going to be something that people consume as much of. That is supply and demand. So that's what we're looking at as far as the future is concerned. We're going to have to get used to consuming less. And on top of that, we're going to have the government printing money. And I just don't know how this ends. I hope that, we can save the dollar, because all my savings are in dollars. Sure, I could buy gold and all that, but then I have to have somewhere to store the gold. And then when you go to sell the gold, it's hard to get a good, it's hard to get spot price back for it. You struggle to buy gold at spot price, but then you can't get anywhere near that for when you sell it. If you sell it when you need it, unless you wait for somebody and try and sell it to someone on an individual basis, it's a little hard to liquidate. But anyway, with that said, I think I'll leave things here for today, and I will probably expand on this tomorrow.